Good morning and welcome to Mass Memorial Virtual Sunday School. Theme for the quarter, worship, sacrifices, and offering. Unit 2, Jesus and the Temple, Sunday, July 13, 2025. Lesson title, A Question of Authority, from Matthew 12, 1 through 8, King James Version. Our key verse, I say unto you, that in this place is one greater than the temple. Matthew 12, 6, King James Version. The aim for our lesson is to discern how Jesus' teachings and actions help us to see the limitations of rules and institutions, to assess the convictions of faith as they pertain to today's laws and social norms, and also to interpret and implement Jesus' guidance as it relates to expressions of religious observance in our church tradition. Some of the lesson background, we've been in the book of Matthew before, so I'm just going to highlight a few issues from this book. The book of Matthew is the first book of the New Testament. Matthew is setting the tone for who Jesus is by our lineage from King David. Matthew wrote to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. He used many Old Testament prophecies to back up his point. Matthew presented in his writing Jesus' person, principle, and power to the Jews, especially religious leaders. The book of Matthew also highlights the ongoing conflict among Jesus and religious leaders. And one of those conflicts is the essence of our lesson today. And in Matthew chapter 12, this is the first recorded conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees. Continue with lesson background. Matthew was one of the original apostles to follow Christ. He was a tax collector that was not well liked because people accused him of collaboration with the Roman government. Matthew was chosen by Jesus and later hosted a feast for other tax collectors and sinners. And this lesson just kind of lets us know that tax collecting is not new, that it's been around for centuries, and it is a duty that is done on behalf of the government. So we see Matthew was a tax collector for the Roman government. Next important word in our lesson is Pharisees. The Pharisees was a prominent Jewish sect that was known for their strict adherence to Jewish law, both written, which is the Torah, and oral traditions. They also believed in the resurrection of the dead and the afterlife. They emphasized personal piety and the application of the law to all Jews and not just to the priests. The Pharisees was one of the most arrogant of all Jewish groups. And if you remember the story of Jesus being found guilty of blasphemy, it was the religious leaders who accused him, mostly the Pharisees. Another important word in our lesson today is the word Sabbath. The seventh day of the week, which goes back to the creation when God purposely stopped or ceased creating new things. God blessed the Sabbath and called it holy. God's gift of the Sabbath provided the opportunity for man to refresh themselves physically, mentally, and spiritually through the cessation of physical activity and to worship. So it's very simple. He made the seventh day for us to rest, but I think the seventh day no longer is a rest period for most people now because we do everything on the Sabbath or on that designated day. Another important aspect of the background is the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. And this is something we see happening even today. The Pharisees were in conflict with Jesus' teaching because they paid strict attention to the law without regard for human care or service. And we see that laws are being made now without regard to what effect it will have on those that are poor or those that, can't afford independent medical insurance. So what was happening back then is still happening today. So as we get into our lesson scriptures, I will read Matthew 12, 1 through 3. Matthew 12:1. At that, when Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were hungered, and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. Matthew 12:2. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, Behold, they disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath. Matthew 12:3. But he said unto them, Have ye not read what David did when he was hungered, and that they were with him? So in these two verses, the Pharisees are people that's sitting back, watching and seeing who's going to break the law. So these two verses describe the incident that created the conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees. Now, here people are hungry and they have corn to eat, but because it was on the Sabbath, the Pharisees felt like it was a sin for them to go and pluck the corn out of the field, even though they were hungry. So this really created a confrontation. And so if we look at verses Matthew 12:2 and 12:3, Jesus really got upset. This conversation kind of went tit for tat if we look at the scriptures and how the confrontation occurred. Jesus had a different interpretation of the Mosaic law, and he brought this out when he made reference to David. And what happened, and why he made reference to David, David was hungry and entered the house of God to eat the showbread, which is the communion bread, which under the law was not legal for him to do and was only allowed to be done by the priest. So here again, the Pharisees are saying it's unlawful for you to pluck corn, but Jesus said, well, even David went into the temple and ate the bread when he wasn't supposed to, according to the Pharisees. So Jesus pointed out this point that human needs should dictate exceptions to strict adherence to religious rules and should provide compassion and empathy and guidance in the ministry. But this was not the concern of the Pharisees. They didn't care about the compassion. They didn't care whether they were hungry. It's just the fact that they went in the field on the Sabbath day. So here again, even in today, we're looking at laws that people are making that will be strictly adhered to, but how much damage will be done to the people? There's no thought of compassion. There's no caring as to people that would be unable to afford medical insurance, medicine. So this is the same thing happening today. And so we see that this was a real ongoing conversation between the Pharisees and Jesus. And so as we look into verse 4 and 5, Matthew 12:4, how he entered into the house of God and did eat. He's talking about David eating the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, and neither for them which were with them, but only for the priests. It's just saying that the communion bread was only designated for the priest. Matthew 12:5, or have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? When I say this conversation went tit for tat, Jesus is pointing out that the priests in the temple were working on the Sabbath to fulfill their duties as priests, but they were considered blameless. The Pharisees didn't blame them. So Jesus was saying, how can you make this difference between the priests who work on the Sabbath and these men who ate on the Sabbath because they were hungry? So he said, it's ridiculous. He said, God commanded the priest's duties on the Sabbath, so which means that it was okay for them to work. So Jesus pointed out the principle of service to God. His people and humanity must prioritize and balance what they have to do with the purpose of the Sabbath, which is to honor God. So it kind of gives us the idea that we should not strictly adhere to laws that interfere with helping people, whether it be on the Sabbath. I think there's a section in the New Testament where Jesus at one time said, if a man's horse or mule fall by the wayside or fall in a ditch on the Sabbath, are you going to let it stay there, or are you going to pull it out so that man can go on with his existence? And so this is so important because the Pharisees actually really forgot the essence of the Sabbath. All they knew, if you look at it literally, the Sabbath was a word to them, a word within the law. And they didn't relate that word to the people. And so this is what Jesus was trying to point out, the principle of service to God's people and prioritizing worship and service on his behalf. So if we go back, even in our own day, there were times when the Sabbath, on the Sabbath, stores were closed. There was no movie theater open. I mean, people spent that day worshiping. They prepared their food the day before. There was nothing done on the Sabbath but worship and going to church. So many of our people are familiar with that, especially if you were from the South. That Sabbath, that Sunday was dedicated strictly to worship. But we also have to ask ourselves, can we really imagine now a day with no stores open, no movies open, no restaurants available, and everything would cease except maybe hospitals and churches? No internet, no online media. It's like, what would we do? And so this is kind of the essence of this lesson. But here again, Jesus pointed out humanity and human service must take priority over strict adherence to the law. So as we get into the real essence of the Sabbath Lord, Matthew 12:6-8, King James Version. Matthew 12:6. But I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple. Matthew 12:7. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. Matthew 12:8. For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, in going back to verse 6, Jesus clarifies and says that the Sabbath law was not the most important point of the Sabbath. In verse 6, he made reference by saying that in this place, there's someone greater than the temple. And who he was actually talking about was himself. He is greater than the temple. He is greater than the law that the Pharisees were concerned about. So this is why the disciples really weren't doing what God proposed for the Sabbath, but were misguided by the Pharisees' interpretation of the law. And it really is a misinterpretation. The Pharisees couldn't understand, or didn't want to understand, the human aspect of the law. The law had no humanity as far as the Pharisees go. But Jesus said that's not the case. And so in verse 7, Jesus explained that if the priests were not guilty of violating the Sabbath, then neither were the disciples, which we saw earlier. And he said it was a matter of spiritual responsibility and showing mercy to God's people. The Pharisee rules went beyond what God required for the Sabbath, which meant that strict adherence to the law above showing compassion and mercy was not what it was intended for. It's not what the Sabbath was intended for. And he makes it plain. He emphasized that he is the head of the Sabbath, creator of all things, and that he is greater and holds priority over the law including the Sabbath. And we've often heard the statement that Jesus came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. Here again, we get into the purpose of why the Sabbath was created, which was to allow God's people a physical rest and the opportunity to renew their relationship with Him through worship and spiritual reflection. This goes back to the creation, and God did a lot of work in 6 days. He created the vastness of this earth. When we look around, we see how vast this world is. But even He Himself had to rest. He took a break. He took that 7th-day break and called it the Sabbath. And He was thinking about mankind. He was thinking about the animals. The Sabbath was meant for the rest, for the people, as well as the animals. So it really made sense that there would be a day of rest. But right now, the Pharisees actually had made the Sabbath a burden because they failed to realize the act of mercy on God's part. You know, they were so strict. People were literally afraid to do anything, whether it required human service or whatever. They were literally afraid because breaking of the law was a serious punishment issued out. And so the Pharisees were on guard for anybody who broke those laws. So even today, we find ourselves busy on our designated day of Sabbath, as we do on any other day. It's a day for us in our time to catch up on chores, get groceries, wash the car, shop at the mall, and complain about church service being too long. So here again, God has given us a day of rest to worship Him. And it seems that we are not engaged to do so. But in our lesson, even the Pharisees took this to the extreme. They didn't want you to do anything, nothing on the Sabbath. But Jesus, in His new philosophy, said, no, this is service and compassion for mankind should come first. So in our lesson titled, A Question of Authority, it prompts us to think about who we are giving our time and energy to. Are we resting according to God's designation of the Sabbath? That's an easy question to answer, because if you wait till Sunday come and you get up, ask yourself or record what you do on that day. And it might really surprise you, all the things that we do on a day that we're supposed to be resting. And you know, God was looking out for man from the beginning of creation, because even we can continue to run, we can continue to do things, but the body itself will tell you when it's time to take a break, when it's time to rest. But Jesus wanted you to set aside a day of rest, a day for the animals to rest. Even the animals need to be rested. Basically, we think of them as using back in the day to till the soil, to do the farm work. But even they too, animals need to rest. So this is a good lesson on the literal interpretation of the law and Jesus' interpretation of the law. And we know, because of His crucifixion, that it was the law and the Pharisees not accepting Him as the Son of God. They accused Him of blasphemy. And so here, you know, it's in this lesson, we see the effect of those in authority. If it's not done their way, then it's wrong. And that's the essence of this story. The Pharisees felt like, you're breaking the law because according to our interpretation, you shouldn't be eating corn out of the field. That's basically what it boiled down to. So these same things are happening today. From day to day, if you listen to the news, you think about this lesson, it's very prevalent. The Bible might have been written, the stories might be centuries old, but they are repeating themselves each and every day if we really take time to think about these lessons. So for our standpoint, there should be some practical applications. This lesson, even though it addresses issues faced by Jesus in dealing with the Pharisees and observance of the Sabbath, it lets us know that those that appear pious or in charge will see and act not in the best interest of mankind, but act according to how they want to interpret the law. Even our Christian community can be guilty of legalizing the opportunity to meet the needs of others. And we find that in churches sometimes it's a pick and choose, this group or that group. We're going to serve this person turkey, going to serve that person a hot dog. So everything can boil down to who's in charge. And that's kind of what this lesson is about, because the Pharisees portrayed an arrogance that we see constantly in everyday life. And they were an arrogant and powerful sect. The Pharisees failed to meet the needs of the poor, the sick, and the shut-in. Jesus taught prioritizing human needs and compassionate mercy over strict adherence to the law. And I think if compassion and empathy had any place in the making of laws, we wouldn't see some of the things on the books that we have. And so here again, it comes into play in our day and age. We see this lesson manifesting itself in our society today, as we said before, when we see our leaders or those in charge making laws without consideration of the poor, sick, and those in need. We have many so-called Pharisees around us, are people we elect to represent us, and once in position of power, forget that they are there to serve the people. Jesus wants us to be concerned and compassionate in our lives and in our decision making. And this lesson lets us know Jesus was concerned about the law, but not to the point of ignoring human needs and humanity. So as we go throughout the week, let us be more considerate of others. And I hope you have gained something from this lesson. And I ask that you please continue to join us in our virtual presentations. Thank you.